Welcome to Varn Vlog Radical Engagements, and this is me talking about Tim Baker's article. I told you to stop saying isolationist or pobre América Latina tan lejos de Dios y tan cerca de Estados Unidos. Perdón, mi español es muy gringo, muy pobre, pero entiendo español. Vive en la México por 2 años en el norte. And pardon my poor Spanish. I learned it living in North Mexico. For those of you who don't know much about me, and I talk a lot about myself here, two issues that people always are surprised at my stances on is one is I am not a methodological nationalist, and two, I have a profound interest in Latin America. It is a place that I feel kinship to strongly. I lived in Mexico for several years, and I have worked with immigrants here. I have had many things to say on Venezuela in the past 20 years. There are many interesting experiments in people's democracy that were had in Venezuela. There's several books on it. There was also limitations that it was basically run off oil rents, similar to Norway, and that sanctions meant that those oil rents would be difficult, plus the sour crude that is in Venezuela in its oil belt required a lot of refineries to make and run, and that like many things involving oil, it is not as immediately obvious what was at stake. It's not just blood for oil, although it is ultimately blood for oil. But I've talked about multipolarity and isolationism a lot too, that isolationism effectively doesn't exist, and that multipolarity can play out in multiple ways. There is no reason to assume that it leads to 3 or 4 stable poles with imperial overreach over several reasons. Although there are many ways in which you may have noticed that while the talk on China has been to justify a lot of these tariffs, that the actual U.S. policy of China has actually softened a little bit under Trump and has been somewhat softened back despite all the public displays and trade wars that are going on. And that's because regionally, this is the U.S. hadering and rawling itself. It's not giving up its empire. It's in a different phase of it. This is not a show of strength, obviously. There's a lot that's confusing on the ground. I've seen reports of the Chinese being there just before the attack. Clearly, there were a lot of inside people, not just in the opposition, but also in the Maduro regime. Delchi was seems to be favored to actually continue running the country. There don't seem to be many other plans. There have been talks about already and been expanding this into Greenland, into Colombia. We remember the prior threats against Steinbaum. But it's hard to see the U.S. having the bodies or the will to want to put boots on the ground in that many places at once. But while it is about oil, it is not just about oil. I mean, there's a major case coming up to American courts about Venezuela's debts. There is the fact that Venezuela's heavy sour crude would actually be good for refineries that we have here. But there's also a lot of indications that we frankly don't really need it right now. The United States is, the United States oil companies are not necessarily pursuing this in the same way. And what you're actually seeing go into this are a lot of financial companies. And this is all within 48 hours, and I've been reading as much as I can on it. And not just in English. I can more or less read Spanish, as I tried to illustrate to you in the beginning of today. I don't get a lot of my news about Mexico or Cuba or Guatemala or Venezuela from US sources because I'm not an idiot. So it's something you should be thinking about when I talk to you tonight. But I wanted to talk about the Don Roe doctrine because Donald Trump can't resist a bastardized portmanteau. The Cheetah Benito really loves that shit. And that we've had, 2 years now of arguing about socialist mayors from people who priorly opposed localism and all kinds of strategies. And I have lots to say about what Mamdani is and is not doing. He appears to be both more and less radical than I expected. We have more important things to talk about because on one hand, it seems like we're poised for war. On another hand, actually, it seems like we're poised for something completely different, which is a geopolitical realignment where the United States hatrons as well as its empires. And everyone from Peter Zion on the liberal realist, aggressive realist side to, the aggressive realist of John Mersheimer have been saying we were going to do this. That the cost of maintaining the entire world's blue water trade was going to be beyond our scope, and we really weren't doing a good job, and we knew that. And pivoting towards U.S. crude, even though there's lots of Saudi crude cheap in the market, pivots us away from Eurasia, and thus the gateway to Eurasia, the Levant. Now, I say all this with everyone's a fucking pundit now, and everyone wants to move away, but moving back to the Monroe Doctrine is basically moving back to an earlier phase of American empire. And it is perfectly in line with multipolarity, as you've seen, picked up. Now, you talk about violations of state sovereignty, which this clearly is, but we've done this before. You probably have recently, in the last 24 hours, taught yourself about the 89 invasion of Panama and the removal of Noriega. I happen to remember it because I was 9 years old at the time and saw it in newspapers and on the nightly news on CBS at 6:30. I believe that early would have still been Dan Rather, but I can't. Might have been someone else. I'm trying to remember. But I remember learning about this. I remember learning about the Iran-Contras. I remember learning all this stuff when I was too young to know what it meant. And a lot of people are going to be like that today. Is this a new Iraq war? Well, in some ways it could be worse. Jungle fighting can be very hard and the resistance is what it is, but it doesn't look like there's going to be that much regime change. This was a removal of a person, not a regime. At least so far. And Donald Trump's "we run it, but also we're going to let the vice president stay" maybe is up in the air. Are we at war? Who knows? Doesn't seem like it. We're technically not. Congress didn't declare it, but no one even feels the need to tell Congress anymore. I would not be surprised if the Russians and the Chinese knew when Congress didn't. Nonetheless, we are where we are. It looks like Delcy gets to be Yeltsin to maybe our own Yeltsin, and who knows? There'll be a lot of speculation over where Trump goes next, over whether or not we're entering World War III. I like to remind people that nukes do still exist. But don't be fooled. The difference between neocons and these isolationist paleocons isn't a difference in their opinions about war. It's a difference about where the empire's focus should be. And I got to give Tim Barker credit for this because he caught on to this fairly early, as did Danny Besner and Derick Donaldson, I believe, over at American Prestige. I've talked to Danny many times. And we've known with the bombing of fishing boats and whatnot, which is clearly not legal under international law, a bunch of treaties that no one enforces and have always existed in their breach anyway, but also even under U.S. law. But U.S. law is only as enforceable as the institutions who seek to enforce it, and since Congress doesn't want to do its job and really hasn't wanted to do its job for 2 whole fucking generations, really has abnegated on that since fucking Vietnam, 3 generations. Who's to say? Let's get into the article. I told you to stop saying isolationist. Pobre America Latina, tan lejos de Dios y tan cerca de Estados Unidos. So far from God, so close to the United States. The newly released White House National Security Strategy raises again the question of whether Americans are turning isolationist. Karl Rove, Wall Street Journal, December 10th, 2025. Will the isolationist or interventionist win out? December 30th, 2025. President Trump announced that the U.S. forces had carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela and were flying President Nicolas Maduro and his wife out of the country. New York Times just now, and this was on the 3rd. I'm recording this from the 4th. This will be released on the 5th. So I read this article before. Stop Saying Isolationist by Tim Baker, but I want to talk about it now. At one point in Joseph Heller's Goes Gold, the main character determines one of his frenemies. Don't words mean anything to you? This is how I hear when I hear people read or talking about isolationism. Bret Stephens is not only one of the dumbest of countless pundits making objectively false statements such as, it's J.D. Vance's isolationist instincts that stand out the most and worry me the most. Vance is really one of the Republicans who thinks that practically the only foreign policy we need is the country's secure, militarized southern border. Now, I'm going to go back to Tim commenting on it today because I've already read this. In the piece I linked above to point out that the original Americans first believed that our true mission is North America and South America. With the resources and organizing ability, we can develop a virgin continent like South America. No government in Mexico, Central America, and Caribbean, South American countries will be tolerated unless it is friendly to the United States. We are prepared to use force to attain this objective. If this sounds like a bunch of other spheres of influence that exist in the world right now, maybe there's a fucking reason for that. It is ludicrous to call this isolationism. What's the alternative? There is no perfect term to substitute for isolationism. The following of my intellectual heroes, Bruce Cumming and Mike Davis, I think good default is nationalism. People on both sides in 1940 would have understood the term and accepted it as value neutral. For example, Michigan's author Vandenberg described a contest between Eastern Internationalist School of Thought and Midwestern Nationalist School of Thought. At the time, Vandenberg identified himself with the nationalist, though this would famously change. But to me, that ideological switch shows the utility of the term. Vandenberg calls himself a nationalist when he was a nationalist and an internationalist when he was an internationalist. Of course, there is no reason that we should necessarily refer to the categories used by historical actors, but nationalism also fits very well into the language used today. The words connect: economic nationalism to the protectionist impulses to Robert Taft, Robert E. Wood, Pat Buchanan, and James David Vance. No one has ever imagined that nationalism was inconsistent with expansionism, so the concept allows for so-called isolationists to have a foreign policy, indeed a militaristic vision of their own. Just something to keep in mind. It's what Trump and Vance have said about Mexico. And when the seeming justification for Mexico went away, here we are. The heuristic of value of interventionist nationalism is confirmed by the current attack against Venezuela, which is being presented as an extension of domestic law enforcement, which is crazy in and of itself, rather than a military conflict between sovereign states. Thus, in announcing the capture of Maduro, President Trump said it was done in conjunction with U.S. law enforcement, done by the military, that this indictment was sworn in the Southern District of New York. Attorney General Pambanis and Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, will face American justice on American soil and American courts, which I'm going to know is different than even what we did to Saddam Hussein, who faced American justice in Iraqi courts under an installed regime, but it was Iraqi courts. The U.S. official said there are no American casualties in the operations. He would not comment on Venezuelan casualties. I almost certainly there are some, although how many, I don't know. The American nationalist right is hardly unique in justifying foreign intervention as a matter of domestic politics rather than international relations. This is how the Chinese party thinks of Taiwan. This is how Stalin felt the same way about Czechoslovakia. Governments say whatever they want. It's up to everyone else to decide whether to fall for it. A multipolar world is not a world without empire, people. It's a world with different empires competing over it and pulling from one another on their peripheries. It's also a world where the peripherization will become internalized and the contradictions are going to get heated. Are most American companies going to want this Venezuelan oil? Maybe not, but a lot of American finance companies are going to want access to the possibility of futures from it, and they're going to want, a way to level past debts against Venezuela. And you might see lots of right-wing governments in Latin America, and even some center-left ones be very quiet on this, or even support it. The legitimacy of Maduro is not something I'm here to comment on. I mean, hell, I don't even think dictators are always bad. After all, a dictator is often someone who stabilizes things when there is a stasis. What would be a predecessor to the concept of civil war, where social wars and social conflicts makes governing impossible. But I'm also not big on rigging democracies and prefer my dictators to be formally announced and temporary. And they rarely ever stay so. Thank you, 20th century, for making that clear. So I'm not here to throw insults or defenses about Maduro. The Maduro regime has had issues for a long time. His vice president has been shoring up his economy. There's been leaked rumors of sweetheart deals offered by that government, but that Maduro was going to have to go into exile, which he would not do. So here we are. So many more dreams go up in smokes. What this means for the next year's domestic politics, who knows? We might be entering into what is often the case in president's second term, and not limited to Republicans, I might add, is foreign policy adventurism. When domestic policy becomes more and more tenuous. And it very much looks like a lot of Trump's domestic policy agendas are so contested even within the GOP now, as the obvious results of the rooting of the big, beautiful bill become very clear. Meanwhile, you have inner contention amongst the Democrats. You have whatever's going on in New York. You have mass confusion amongst the left here. I mean, the left right now seems to think the most important thing it should be doing is arguing about the fucking 1950s and not looking at the Sino-Soviet split. And all of this is rather academic today, since the only state that still exists is the PRC, and I guess the United States. If there's history to be learned about now, it's hard to know what it is. And yet this all moves on. How the great powers, and there are great powers now, react to this return to 19th century politics is beyond me. But I will say this. If you were dumb enough to not listen to me when I warned that multipolarity could be many things, and one of them was a different form of empire, that an empire Hadrian's walling itself does not mean that it's done. People talk about the 150, 250 year cycle of empires. Motherfuckers, do you know how long there was parts of the Roman Empire around? Do you know how many times that Hadrian's walled itself? Do you know anything about the Byzantines? who didn't call themselves Byzantines. They called themselves Romans because that's what they were. They just spoke Greek. So yeah, I'm angry. I don't think this means American power is on the rise. I also don't think it means it is going to immediately fall. Resistance will be needed, but who knows where it's going to come from. Americans do not want a war in Venezuela when they in generic polls, but they are generic polls, and if there is no war, who knows? People barely remember Noriega and Panama. I'm sure the Panamanians do. In fact, I know they do. Talk to a few, but nonetheless. I am not here to give you hope. I am not here to tell you there's going to be a better day, and I'm not here to be a pundit. I don't know what's going to. I don't know whether or not we're looking at World War III or just a multipolar world. I don't know which multipolar world the world is going to pick. But it's changing. Nothing ever happens until something does. Protect your peace. That may be more than a metaphor these days.